Welcome back, everybody. Big day today. We've been talking about this for a couple of weeks, maybe a few months now, Jay.
Oh, at least.
Doctors in the house.
Oh, yeah. Professors in the house. We're going to get educated today for sure.
Yeah, so we've had some viewer questions as well. Everybody wants to know everything that Garry Nolan has in his brain. And unfortunately, he is too big an intellect that we can't dissect it all in an hour. So we're going to try to get to the most pertinent things, the most pressing questions, and find out, I mean, I know for myself, I want to know a little bit about metamaterials. I don't know anyone other than him or Hal Puthoff maybe that I would rather have that discussion with. I know you've got some medical effects questions you want to go over.
Yep.
So it's going to be an interesting day today. I've had a lot of good feedback. So for all who've been waiting, the day has now arrived. The time is here. Best part of my day is I get to say, we'll be right back with Dr. Garry Nolan on UAP Studies Podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to UAP Studies Podcast. My name is Louis Borges. Joining me, as always, my best buddy, Jason Gilmet. How you doing?
I'm doing good. The professor's in the house today.
Yeah, we are all going to get learned from Dr. Garry Nolan today. And for anybody who hasn't heard of him, I don't know of anyone that doesn't, but if you're not familiar, we are dealing with a legitimate medical doctor, an immunologist. He's an author and a researcher, an academic inventor. Some of his areas of expertise include inflammatory responses, cancer, leukemia, autoimmunity. And I'll just ask Garry, like most doctors don't get into UFOs and UAPs. So what was it about that kind of got your medical brain sparked?
Well, it was, I mean, I've told this story a few times, but it was with basically a couple of people from the intelligence services and an aerospace corporation showing up in my office at Stanford unexpectedly, asking for help. And they'd come to me primarily because they'd heard that I had, one of the world's best blood analysis tools recently developed, Isotopic, that I worked on with this guy by the name of Scott Tanner at the University of Toronto. And so it just enabled us to do a deeper dive into the blood and inflammatory events. And they were doing a complete medical workup on some of these patients that they had. And that was basically how I got started. I mean, I've talked about this before. I had a couple of incidents when I was very young, but it wasn't something that motivated me to get involved proactively. It was really these people who showed up. And of course, I had done the Atacama skeleton study on the genetics of it, showing it was human. But that was more just kind of as a lark. So I was kind of already imbued with some of the knowledge in the area. And then that was when they all showed up. And as it turned out, many of these individuals had been involved with ATIP. Colm Kelleher was in the background of all of this. And if you've read his recent book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, I actually was surprised back as far as 2008, 2009, they were already talking about using the immune system of humans as sort of a readout. So it was kind of a natural, step for them to eventually reach out to me once they found out that I was, willing to talk about the area.
Yeah, and we had Dr. Colm Kelleher on our show. We interviewed him and George Knapp about that same book, and it was amazing to talk about some of the medical effects that happen with these encounters.
Yeah.
He described like Hashimoto's disease or Havana syndrome, just some obscure things that we really didn't know much about, but yet they seem to happen in quantity, more than would be
radiation
just random.
as well, right? Radiation exposure. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you could fill us in a little bit about on some of these medical side effects that seem to happen with contact.
Well, one of the worst ones, and I had we had actually almost twice yearly meetings with let's say, the little invisible college of Eric and Hal and Jacques and Colm and Kit, George Hathaway, and a couple of others who can't be named. John Scheusler, one of the original guys who ran MUFON back in the day. And I do remember one of the most extreme examples was one that was actually talked about in the book, of a guy who saw something in his backyard. He shined a light at it, and it zapped the bejesus out of him. And I still have the picture of the injury that the man got, as well as what he drew, and it was, quite extraordinary, I'd have to say. So, these are all anecdotes and stories, but I don't dismiss anecdotes as being irrelevant. I think they're just part of they're just more data. And the more often these anecdotes actually seem to show the same or talk about the same phenomenon, to me at least, the more likely, not that they're necessarily true, but that they're worth investigating.
Yeah.
Yeah. What we brought this up before, but in the Congress, the recent papers that got released, we thought it was funny because they said or mentioned in it that there was no incidences of health risks with these UAPs in flight, or no crashes or anything like that.
Absolute rubbish.
Yeah, right? Because when they land, there's issues, right? And people do get, like I said, radiation or some weird sort of disease from contacts with these things. So I wonder why they stopped at just, space, air, and marine. It's like they should also investigate when these things land on the ground.
Well, if you actually look in the language of the defense bill, it does actually talk about injury and harm to individuals, and it specifically calls it out. So no matter what the DoD might be saying publicly about this or that event, the language of the defense bill specifically calls out that they should be cataloged and understood.
Right.
I mean, look, this was the so-called weird bucket that Kit Green had access to, of all of these individuals who had these strange events. I would say easily 90% of them ended up being Havana syndrome. But we were literally looking at what, even before Havana syndrome was a thing, we were looking at those patients, people who had these things happening to them that had nothing to do with UAP necessarily, but they were all they were hearing things, they were feeling badly, unexpectedly, et cetera, and they got put in the bucket along with people who did have some kind of encounter and had been hurt. And so, I have to be honest. I mean, it not only did this group first find those individuals, but then secondarily, what Lou and Chris and others managed to do is open the aperture and the filters of what's seen, and we can fully claim credit for having enabled the U.S. government to see these balloons and other things that ended up being purely probably terrestrial, but still a danger to U.S. interests, or let's say Western interests.
Right.
Yeah. I've heard you say on the record before that the phenomenon, and maybe I'm paraphrasing, but the phenomenon is akin to angels, demons, and God. And I want you to elaborate on that, because in my mind, I think of it in two ways. Well, one, is that the actual replacement for what we've been calling angels and demons and God? Or are they so far out there, out of our grasp of understanding, that they might as well be gods, quote unquote? Maybe you can elaborate.
I mean, I think Arthur C. Clarke said it probably first best, the notion that any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic, right? And so, I mean, you're talking about the same thing, that to anybody who is, let's say, unsophisticated, and I count us amongst them, some of the things that we observe look like magic to us. I mean, these manifestations and things moving from 0 to 100. I mean, I don't want to think of the word magic as woo. I want to think of the word what we perceive as magic as unexplained science. And so I'm always looking for the tether or the hook that we can use to understand how these strange phenomena are manifesting in the material world. I mean, remote viewing as an example, or people who clearly can garner access to information that they shouldn't have in their head. So I'm just fascinated by the idea that it appears to be possible So how is the information being manifested in their heads? How does the information go from a place we don't understand to where we think we understand it as a neurophysical or neurochemical operation? And are some people better at it than others? In other words, they have an antenna or a protein structure in their brain that allows them to collect that information. And so, that to me stipulates genetics as the architecture for creating the brain structure, and maybe, these kinds of abilities run in families. It's all speculation, but I'm not going to argue with anybody about what it is. But I'm going to argue with people for them to look at the data and agree with me that the data at the very least is real. We can all come up with different reasons for how it happens. Is it a trick? Is it a hoax? Is it real, etc.? But I just want serious scientists to take a look at the data and not dismiss it. And part of the reason why I don't like seeing people dismiss things is, the people who come forward with these ideas are doing so honestly. And so to be laughed out of the room or attempt to laugh people out of the room is first of all, it's just rude. Second, it's from a scientific standpoint inappropriate. You as a scientist, when you get your PhD or MD, or if you're claiming to be a scientist, you basically are taking an oath that nothing is ever taken off the table until formally and completely proven as being impossible or not the right answer. And so if you take things off the table, you basically are breaking your oath. And so I just that kind of aggravates me. I don't know what it is. It's just sort of like a self-righteousness on my part that I don't like seeing people do that. And I don't like seeing people derided, right, and dismissed, especially when they're coming forward honestly. I mean, if scientists want to be accepted as the arbiters of truth, the last thing you should be doing is laughing lay people out of the room.
Right. And that's happened time and again within science. Right. And we were talking to Jimmy Blanchette not that long ago, and he was mentioning that, that it's been sort of part of science now that, you'll get laughed at for looking at something. Now we got people like yourselves and Avi Loeb, like, people of high reputation, and you guys are smart, like you're intelligent people, and you're looking into this seriously. And this is fascinating. We haven't had that in the past. Like, we haven't had the science community sort of step up to the plate and say, hey, there's actually something here. And you guys are doing that. Like, it's amazing.
I would hate to put Avi and I in a unique place because, in the 50s and 60s, there were people who came forward and did it, and they've just unfortunately been forgotten. I think I was watching Leslie Kean's third or fourth episode of her show last night, going into a level of detail about Alan Hynek anyway, and he was, he was really a pioneer in pushing this area. There have been other pioneers pushing, let's say, parapsychology, serious scientists, and they just get forgotten. And we're so in some ways we're just rediscovering those past events. And in fact, one of the things I want to do is go back and read a lot more now about Alan Hynek, because again, some of the means of rhetoric that he used to combat some of the skeptics is why should I have to relearn it if he's already come up with it?
Right.
Yeah. And we chatted with Donald Schmidt the other day. He's an upcoming episode, and he was basically, I think he worked with J. Allen Hynek for 8 years towards the end of his life. And that was at a stage in his career where he was done kind of sugarcoating things. He within his circle, he was giving everybody the goods because he wanted this. And he just talked about how initially the government hired this guy to debunk it, but he didn't go that way. And he really believed by the end of it that there is a phenomenon. It needs to be looked at. And if it wasn't for his efforts, that we wouldn't be here now. But it's amazing how people change. Even Jacques Vallée, we chat with him, and I asked him, I said, Jacques, in your age, what do you want to tell everybody after doing this for decades? And he just said, suspend judgment. He said, if I went with every theory I ever had, I would have been wrong a dozen times. And to Jason's point about Jimmy Blanchette, when you deal with mathematicians and guys writing formula, it's difficult to say, well, I know I've been talking about this and pushing this theory for 30 years, but maybe I was wrong. So there's a bit of pride and ego to kind of keep the old guard and not allow some of these new ideas in physics or just science in general to come to the forefront. It's not a old man versus young man thing, but sometimes it's like we kind of look at it like that. You're either the old guard or the new open-minded guys like yourself.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I'm heartened by the number of people who are now openly willing to discuss the matter. My email is usually full of two kinds of emails. One, let's call them lay people who have had experiences and want my input on something. Very often they just are telling me something, and they're not asking me for anything. They just want to have somebody to listen.
Right.
And so, I do my best to respond to these. I mean, what's my current that I haven't answered? There's 554 emails in this particular subfolder of mine from all kinds of people. But then there was also the scientist emails that I get. They say, "Hey, I want to help." I got an email from somebody at NVIDIA the other day, and they said, "Hey, there's a whole group of us here at NVIDIA, and we would love to be able to help. What can we do?" And so my answer back to them is, "Well, look, I can put you in contact with people who are doing machine learning, and maybe maybe NVIDIA could sponsor, with some of your GPUs, the machine learning stuff that they're wanting to do." And then I get emails from doctors or psychiatrists who say, "Hey, are there people I can help?" And so that's good. I mean, it's going to be a slow process, and I'm not I'm not starry-eyed about that everything is going to open up by the summertime. I think there's going to be a give and take, and there might be a retrenchment of pushbacks that put this back in the hole for another 10 years. I hope not. But I do think that each time this happens, we open the aperture just that little bit more, and bring in more people. I never get any more when I go out into my mainstream arena, any pushback. People, in fact, introduce me for my mainstream talks and say, "Hey, if you want, Gary, we'll talk about this other area later with you." Or I get those questions at dinner. People come up to me and have these kinds of questions, and they're serious about it. I mean, I just look at again, I was watching in Leslie Kean's thing. They were talking about the event that happened in Chicago at the United Terminal, and how the Chicago Tribune, it was the most clicked on story in Chicago Tribune's history. The New York Times event was, again, the most clicked on story ever. And so you can't say that the public is uninterested in this.
Yeah. Well, the public, it's amazing the amount of people, you mentioned this before on a podcast. I saw you mention this as well. But once they know that you're open to the possibilities of these crafts being from somewhere else, some other intelligence, they open up and they have stories themselves. Or I had this one gentleman this week say, "Well, my dad worked for NORAD, and he's seen some stuff." And I'm like, it's amazing, like just general encounters, the amount of people that have seen it. And you know what, Gary, even talking to other people that have been in the Defense Department and the military, they're all experiencing this as well. We had Jim Semivan, which explained that he woke up one night with 3 little dudes in his room.
Yeah, no, I knew about that like 5 or 6 years ago and visited his house and heard the story, and there's some pretty frightening stuff related.
Yeah. But the fact that it's happening to people within the Defense Department, the people that are in charge of guarding countries, that's where disclosure comes from. It's like these people coming forward and science, stepping up and saying, "Okay, let's investigate. How can we do this?" And one question I had for you, because I know science, usually you have to do experiments in a controlled way or something that's repeatable.
Mhm.
It's difficult with this field, isn't it? Because there's no way for us to repeat these events.
So I mean, I think, which is why at one level, the areas that I focused primarily on are materials. and studying materials, because those are repeatable.
Right.
And why I focused on the medical issue, because that's data I can collect, I can verify, I can hand to somebody else. They'll know that I didn't fake the MRI, and so those are more material aspects. It's why I leave the historical arguments to the historians and the philosophers, because we've been around some of these arguments so many times that no further argument is going to convince anybody of anything if they've already got an opinion. But I do think, though, that the stories and the anecdotes can be corralled into a story of proof. And it's something that some time needs to be spent on to figure out, how do we turn these stories into a proof? Because in a psychology journal, you can do a whole bunch of interviews of people, and you can come up with a set of conclusions about human mental consciousness and reality that is taken as truth and proof. So I think it's going to need somebody who's good at those kinds of studies to address the problem. But a different way of looking at it is, and I was talking about this just yesterday or 2 days ago on another podcast, is let's look at what's going on in the government right now, where Arrow and/or the DoD are coming out and saying, well, this set of objects we know and we can dismiss as knowns or knowables, and then we've got this other class, and what they're doing is they're playing basically games with words here, where they've got this other class where there's actually two subclasses within that other class. One is there's not enough data to say anything about it whatsoever. There's just not enough data. But there's some anomalous information there. And then there's absolutely anomalous information where they've disproven that it's Chinese or Russian or ours. And yet, because they've set up their structure as, if I can't prove what it is, I'm going to say that it's not alien. And so they're playing this game where they're using the insufficiently understood objects to cloak the sufficiently understood but not defined objects, and just basically saying, well, they're nothing, we don't understand. They won't admit to anything until they understand what it is. And if it's never going to land and say, hi, I'm an alien, they're playing this game where they're not coming forward honestly and saying, hey, this is just not ours, and it's a technology. So I've been struggling with trying to find a definition or a word that we can use for each of these two classes to start to now force the DoD to admit that these things that they have sufficient information on, that it is something which is not human at the very least, and anomalous. You see the game they're playing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's maybe I'm just not smart enough to figure out how to turn it into a verbiage yet, but it's something that I think the field at large needs to think more about, and we need to force them to basically come forward and say, look, this is either class 1 or class 2.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that the search for proof is what everybody's looking for, and everybody's version of proof is different. So even if you had proof, somebody would just discredit it. But I think some of the harder things to discredit are physical, tangible, like you said, medical effects, injuries, metamaterials. And I know you know quite a bit about it. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. And the thing that got me interested in metamaterials was this sample that apparently went to Art Bell years ago, was supposedly from a crash retrieval. It was then given to Linda Moulton Howe. And then I think TTSA subsequently bought it for like 35 grand to analyze. And Hal Puthoff did a whole presentation on it. And basically the sum of it, and I'm sure you're well aware and you can elaborate, but I couldn't believe that the way that this metal was created, the thinness of the layers, the bismuth and magnesium, I think it was made from, had a different isotopic signature, something that didn't come from Earth per se. And they couldn't figure out what it would be used for, or who would want to make something like that. And that maybe even perhaps, I hope you're reaching for a sample of metamaterials right now. That would blow my mind. But long story short, they hypothesized that the way it was made would create a waveform of some sort, or like a wave guide, and that's perhaps how these craft move. So, what can you tell us about metamaterials? I'm fascinated.
There's a piece of the material, and unfortunately, it can't focus well
That's
enough.
the same metal I was just
wanna, like,
referencing.
lean in and
Yeah, that's the one that this is a piece of the same material.
Yeah, yeah, multi-layered, right?
Layered material.
So how is something like that made? I mean, the thinness of it, the amount of layers. I know there's been other samples that are alloys with like 17 different base compound. Like, why would you go through the effort to make something like that? And they're definitely not being used currently. So what do you make of that?
Well, I'm not enough of a metallurgist to say why or how somebody would make it. But I have verified that in that one, the magnesium isotopes seem to be inverted. Instead of it being, let's say, 89, 11, and 9, it's 89, 9, and 11.
Yeah.
And, but I'm not sure that there's not a good physical reason why the manner in which it was analyzed didn't give that inverted ratio, but somebody else had noted the same inverted ratio.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what it means, and I don't think it's necessarily proof of anything. People say that they don't know how to make this again, but that doesn't mean that somebody didn't find a way to make it. Until you show that it has a function that you can't understand, then there's a good reason to believe that, or there's no good reason to believe that it was alien.
Right.
Let's say it that way. But one of the things that I will be doing on this is doing an atomic structure analysis of it. The reason why I took it out of I have it here is because I'm setting up to do just that analysis, and I took it out of the bank vaults where I keep all of my stuff. Because maybe that will give me a clue as to that it's made in a manner that's different than how others might make it, or that it's made somehow in a way that there's no comparable material on Earth. It doesn't mean that it is ET.
Yeah.
It just means that it's made. It's clearly a material that is made. It's an industrial process of some kind. But some people have suggested that stuff is just from the bottom of some smelting pot and the layers that occur in the smelting pot. I don't know. I know there's a huge chunk of it, and I know that TTSA has given it to the government, and I know actually quite a bit more about it that I can't talk about, and where it is and who has it now. But I do know that it's about to be subjected to the full range of analysis techniques that it hasn't been subjected to before, or at least it's promised to be. I'm not going to be privy to the data. I just know that that's what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. Appreciate that. And we've got a viewer who's a scientist. And when they found out that you were coming on, they said, ask him how it's possible to have different isotopes. Can that not only exist in a particle accelerator? Like there's many isotopes of elements, but the ones we find here are usually only here, so when you have things that, is there anything you can shed on that?
Well, the way to think about it is that the isotope ratios that we have on Earth iron has 4, I think 4 or 5, titanium has 4 or 5. And, and so the ratios of the isotopes are pretty much determined by the stellar, whatever suns went supernova that had created the various isotopic ratios that eventually coalesced into planet Earth. That's what set the values.
Yeah.
And so you can take iron there's a variety of ways to do it. You can turn it into a gas, and then you can separate the gas by weight and separate out the different purified isotopes. And the instrument that we developed, with this guy Scott Tanner, Cytoph, uses metal isotopes as tags. So we go out and we buy from there's a few companies that actually spend a lot of money doing this, and a few grams of it costs several tens of thousands of dollars to get a 99% pure isotope of this, that, or the other. And the rarer or the smaller the percentage of the isotope, the more expensive it is. So you can get individual isotopes and mix them at whatever ratio you want. So it can be done. It's just expensive as hell.
Yeah.
But more so, and this is the most important aspect of it, is that there's no good physics reason why you would.
Right.
Except maybe to make it a little bit lighter, right? The only reason you might use different ratios is, because some isotopes or some certain number of neutrons and protons are paramagnetic and can be seen and used differentially in a magnetic field. People are now starting to understand that if I put an isotope of carbon here in an enzyme and a different isotope of carbon here in an enzyme, that creates a slightly different electrostatic pull that changes the catalytic activity of the enzyme slightly. So there's subtleties about it, but to use them wholesale in some machine or process, there's just no physics reason that we understand yet for doing so. And yet when you see some of these materials that we've analyzed and they have these way off ratios, it's like, okay, are they using those ratios for something that we don't understand? Is there some subtlety of the physics down at that level that they understand that we don't? Or is this the result of a process, and this is the waste product that ends up creating these different ratios? I just don't know. But when you see those different ratios, you can walk away with one bit of knowledge. Somebody did it.
Yeah.
Somebody caused it to happen.
So in your best estimation, and maybe you can't answer this, but I got to ask, do you believe the planet, governments, whatever, are in possession of actual materials that did not originate here?
Do I believe? I don't believe anything. I trust people's things that they tell me. And so the answer to that would be yes.
Fair enough. And I know you're a science guy. You're not going to emphatically say it's this or it's not unless it can be proven scientifically. I get that. But I just, from what you know, and without giving anything away, I just wanted to know, like, have people told you we have some stuff that's not as explainable? Like, we have explainables that we just can't explain, but they will be explained. We're just not there with science. Then there's the other stuff that's like, that is a totally different category. So that's kind of where
people could walk me into a hangar and show me something they claim to be a UFO, and I still might wonder whether or not it's a hoax.
Yeah. I
have to have some functional proof that it's doing something that we don't understand.
Yeah.
And that's, and I think especially in something of this magnitude, there's any of a number of good reasons why somebody might try to fake things. But I have, again, good reason to trust a number of individuals who are actually part of the reverse engineering or very close to the reverse engineering programs, or who have testified to the fact recently. And so, when you testify, you're under oath. And so, these people are putting their careers at risk for breaking one oath, and they're taking another and telling the truth. So, or what they believe to be the truth.
Yeah. What I find fascinating about these crafts as well is not just the material that seems to be part of these. People have seen UFOs or crafts of up close. but it's also the fact that they can see doors opening out of nowhere, or windows, and then all of a sudden the window disappears or the door disappears. Like, these things tend to be able to move in a certain way. So I find that fascinating, because it also goes to show you what these materials are capable of, right? So
Okay.
All right, we're back. We have the secret government is trying to shut us down here today, it seems. Gary was
Right.
saying that he thinks it's orbs. He blames the
It's
orbs.
orbs. I blame the orbs. Okay, so where was I?
Talking about proof, seeing craft. Just because we don't know how it's made doesn't mean it's automatically ET.
Right. Doesn't mean it's ET. So it's just another notch in your belt about things, but it really is function that that would step up the the proof. Now, if you saw it come down and crash and you collected it after that crash, then you probably don't need any further proof. I'm talking about something that I might just be shown.
Yeah.
So, but the people who've been supposedly collecting these materials, or frankly, if you had a biological of some kind that was, clearly not a hoax, then it's pretty clear that, that would be something that would be sufficient as proof. I think the open question is who is keeping this stuff. I mean, there's the whole, we don't want to scare the populace, but then there's probably something more behind this, that somebody's benefiting and doesn't want anybody else to benefit, or they're afraid that they've done something illegal, or they know that they've done something illegal, and they're wary of being put in jail or called out on it. So, the way around that, as has been discussed, at least around the putting people in jail part of things, is some sort of amnesty. But that might be insufficient if somebody's making a lot of money on it, to lure them out of the shadows. And it could just be somebody who just likes to control things. It might have nothing to do with anything other than they like to be in the secret club and have access to this stuff, and they don't want anybody else to.
Right.
And so, it's this is why I think I'm actually happy about both Arrow and Biden now having the interagency task force, putting a little bit more pressure on things. Whether they achieve anything, I don't know, or whether even if they find anything out, they'll let anybody else know about it. I don't know. And so I'm just hopeful. That's all.
You were mentioning, yeah.
Sorry, Jay. I was just going to say, it seems like there'd be a clear benefit for the military or private companies having access to this technology. Like, it wouldn't make sense to just give it away for free. This can be monetized, weaponized. So if there are findings, it probably would make it into those industries before we would ever know anyways.
Yeah. And, and there's been plenty of discussion, the day after Roswell by Corso and others about how technology has been leaked into public use, more surreptitiously. But I would just say that the best and the brightest are probably not associated with the necessary programs to divine the purpose and function of these things. I would suggest, that they stovepipe them so much. And I mean, science works best when it's open. Right.
Collaboration.
I mean, I have a good example of something that, how unexpectedly the search for, let's say, extraterrestrial life on Mars ended up benefiting all of humanity. So the Viking landers were actually the experiments that were done for life were actually designed in the department where I got my PhD. It was done before I got there. So, and without going into all the details of that, after that program finished, the engineers and the capabilities were put towards the work of this guy by the name of Leonard Herzenberg, Len and Lee Herzenberg, immunologist, who ended up being my my graduate student mentors. And he created this instrument called the fluorescence activated cell sorter, which is used all over the world in immunology and multi-billion-dollar industry for blood analysis. And the money that came in because of that to the Department of Genetics through the patents helped Len and another mentor of mine, this guy Vern Oy, develop what are called humanized antibodies. And the humanized antibodies are used now all over the world for like rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera, brought in another several $billion, and was able to attract Stanley Cohen to be the chairman of the department. And he created with those kinds of money, he created the what are called the Cohen-Boyer patents that were the first of the genetic engineering patents and brought in another bazillion dollars. So the Department of Genetics brought in the 3 biggest patents at Stanford, incredible amounts of money. And what was the root? The Viking search for life, right? So the unexpected outcome was extraordinary benefit to humanity. So let's take that model and apply it to the study of some of these other materials that might be out there. And the unexpected benefits will be, again, extraordinary. Lou Elizondo talks about the number of the economic benefit from what happened with the Apollo missions, right? All of the inventions that came because of that. And so it's that kind of opportunity, I think, that we're currently missing and not taking advantage of. And it's an opportunity missed. It truly is.
Right. And it's a sort of disservice to the general population not to disclose what reality is. If these things are here, if we have some other form of intelligence or intelligence, it could be as complicated as, it's all the above. We've looked at different, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, extraterrestrial. Like, it could be an issue as complex. It could be all of the above,
Right.
And I understand that, it's hard to tell the general public, but at the same time, if that's part of reality, if that's part of the part of the universe, that should be something that should be disclosed to the general population.
So, but I think as well that I've said this before, we shouldn't be waiting for daddy to tell us it's okay to think or understand what we know.
Right.
I mean, if you've observed something, if you're a so-called experiencer, you don't need anybody to give you permission to know what it is, what you saw.
Right.
You might have interpreted it incorrectly or whatever, but you don't need permission. So I think the general public looks to the government for permission to understand or believe something. The government uses scientists to validate that. And so indirectly, then the public is looking to scientists to validate it. I don't need the government to allow me to validate something. I just need to create a sufficient body of literature where I can become the expert or an expert in it. And Avi Loeb is doing a great job at this with the stuff that I know he's about to publish. I mean, there's nothing extraordinary. He's just publishing his materials and methods of how he's doing the analysis in the first iteration, but hopefully soon enough he'll have observations.
Right.
Do you have any info on cool projects going on? Maybe some of the stuff that's not as easily, I'm not saying give away any secrets, but anything cool, any projects, things we're looking at, studying that you could share with our viewers?
Well, I mean, this is more indirect, but I'm part of Avi's Copernicus Space Corporation. I don't know if you know about that. And that's basically an attempt to make thousands of little devices that we're going to spew across the solar system to both look for life as well as look for remnants of past visits, right? Why wait for NASA to create $1 billion rocket to go one place when with several $100 million we can create thousands of little observation cameras that are disposable, and the technology is there for it, and he's got quite a who's who of people on the advisory board with him. one of the areas that I'm involved with is how to design things that would go back to Mars and look for life, and do it in a way that gets around the perchlorate problem on the surface of Mars that basically interfered with the analysis of the Viking results. Perchlorates just are being they're very organically they're active against organics and could mimic some of the ways that the life was being tested for with the Vikings. It was unexpected, those results, but so I mean there's that. I have seen data from a couple of groups now that were pretty extraordinary and obvious interactions with something. I mean, I don't want to get into the details. I'll wait for them to get their data together. I'm going to help them write up the paper, but I've never seen anything so extraordinary.
Right.
I'm sorry for being, you know.
No, you've got to respect people too, and these are your peers, right? So
Yeah,
if you quickly get a name for just giving away people's work, nobody wants to work with you anymore.
Nobody wants to work with you anymore. But it is extraordinary if we can get it down. I mean, it was a once only event, but it was recorded by 2 cameras, and it was very close up. And I don't know how to explain it. But it clearly reacted to their signal, and it got up close and personal. So hopefully they'll be able to put that together in a way that is publishable.
I mention this all the time, but if there's another incident like took place over Phoenix, Arizona in 1997, I believe it was 1997. If that happens again, the government will have absolutely nothing to say on the topic, or will be left, with a bunch of questions from people, because everybody will record it. Mm-hmm. Everybody's got these amazing cameras now built into phones, which I can't even fathom the amount of pixels that it takes. But it's crazy that if this happens again, and it will, because throughout history there's been incidences where something flies over a city. That's really at that point where the government's going to have nothing to say. They have, it's not a secret program. Nobody would fly it, 100 feet above a small city with a black triangle, So yeah, it's always on my mind that this is going to happen. This is why disclosure is seeping into the population more than pouring in, is that people are experiencing this on a global scale. It's not just the United States and Canada. I mean, people in China are experiencing the same problems as we are here. So it's a global issue. And I had a question for you, and this is hypothetical, but what do you think would be needed to bring this to a global attention, for a global issue? Because every government's working on this separately on their own. There's no collaboration. Well, the United States and Canada are collaborating, but what would it take to bring this to the forefront of the global scientific community?
Well, either an event that is viewed by multiple people, just as you were saying,
right?
It's been curiously quiet in terms of you had like the Hudson Valley, you had Arizona, a few other events, although there was one recently in Texas, right? Again, Leslie Keene did a good job of that one. I think perhaps the other way is that from the political angle is what's going on with Project Titan and San Marino, right? Where you've got the country of San Marino, the Republic of San Marino, has agreed to bring it in front of the UN to basically petition the UN now to create a committee. And with Biden's interagency task force as precedent, you could imagine that it might go a little bit further in the UN than it did previously. Previously, I think the UK voted the issue down when it was brought up, years ago by Grenada. So we'll see what happens with that. But you're always up against this notion of there's so much important things going on. There's Ukraine war, Russia, et cetera. Why should we be paying any attention to this? That's always used as the leverage against doing analysis. But I think it's a false equivalence. to try is that, we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right.
But I think it's just going to take, frankly, it might take people outside of the United States to actually do it, because we've just got such built-in controls against it that the U.S. might never be able to overcome it. I mean,
And
frankly,
if they have suppressed it,
if I were president, I would keep firing people at the Air Force until I was able to get somebody in charge who would do what I said.
Yeah, fair enough. But if they have suppressed it for decades, it makes sense why they can't just be so forthcoming. And maybe the people in power now, they were just dealt this mess. They didn't make the policies in the 40s, but they're stuck living with the results. So I think there is some hesitation there.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. It's not going to be answered by us talking about it, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I have only one question left on my part, but there's the science aspect of these objects and how they maneuver, all that. And there seems to be also a consciousness aspect to it as well. I've heard you talk a bit about the basal ganglia. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Basal ganglia.
Some people have it more active than others. And the people that have it more active than others tend to be more on the experiencer side or witnessing side, or, stuff seems to happen to them a little bit more, if I got that correctly. On the conscious side of things, though, this does affect us. Like, somebody has a close encounter. We're talking to Sean Cahill. He was affected by it. Kevin Day, the radar operator, was affected by it. I mean, a lot of people that you've spoken to, they're all affected by it on some deep level. So this is more than just objects in the skies. This is also some sort of interaction. Right. Yeah.
So let me give a little bit of color around the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, you have one on each side of your brain, and it's a pretty complicated structure, and it's an evolutionarily ancient structure as well, but more developed in humans. And it's actually a particular area of the basal ganglia, which is the head of the caudate and the putamen, which are these sort of overlapping areas with these tendrils that reach from the putamen into the caudate. The caudate, when we first observed this, we saw an increase of neural density, and that we first thought was damage, but later realized it wasn't damage. And that was what was common amongst a lot of these individuals. And we think it wasn't common because they were experiencers. We think it was just common because they were high-functioning individuals. But a couple of people who were claimed and alleged remote viewers of high merit had it even more so than most of the other people. And we just happened to have those brain scans. Kit had those brain scans. And so that's what clued us in to the notion that, okay, well, what is it that these high functioning individuals and these remote viewers might have in common? And we intuited that it was intuition. That was really and there was very little in the literature about that at the time, just a couple of studies done that showed when a form of Japanese chess, when people made an extraordinarily unexpected nonlinear move, this area of the brain lit up in fMRI, functional MRI, looking for glucose use basically in your MRI. And it has now in dozens of papers been validated that the caudate size, function, structure is related to information processing and intuition. I mean, it is undoubted now. So everybody who was like laughing at me when I was saying this is like, you guys can just go you can go sit in the corner. You were wrong. I was right. And so that's fascinating. And it's more fascinating because there's a person I know here in Silicon Valley who's doing transcranial stimulation with sound waves. And one of the things that we're going to try is basically seeing if we can twiddle this area of the brain and cause people to think differently. So I think that might be different. I know that he was able to do this with high functioning meditators, and they were able to achieve the meditative state that took them 11 years to do just by him flipping the switch. And that's fascinating, right? So there's not something you can just you can do, because everybody's brain is a little bit different. So you have to map it first, and then you want to twiddle the right areas, and
Right.
you don't want to twiddle the foot fetish side of things.
All of a sudden, I have a
all of a
foot
sudden it's
fetish.
like, whoa, that feels good.
Screw the guy up for life if you do it wrong.
Yeah, that's crazy. So not the consciousness of it, but you were talking about looking at the brain and this basal ganglia. Just quickly, because you were mentioning about opening different areas, would the telepathic communication between these entities and humans have something to do with those?
Well, that's where I mean, intuition is a flash of insight. And the insights that different people get are either visual or auditory or emotional. And so, whatever these insights are, whether they're coming from outside the brain or the Akashic field, as some people would like to think, or transmitted from another place, somehow these ideas come fully formed as pictures. People who do remote viewing, and I did a remote viewing once, only once, with this guy Ed May, who's a specialist in it. And you get these flashes, and it's like, okay, how did I get a flash of something like that, where I get the complete image? So it's overlaying onto probably pre-existing hardware, is the way to think about it. And if your hardware happens to be, if you're a visual person, or if you're a listening person, or you have other, you olfactory or what have you, the information can come in through multiple channels, but it's somehow coming in almost fully formed. So I think that that's where, if you want to imagine that consciousness is something separate from the brain, that the information must be coming prepackaged, hitting the consciousness, but then is relayed onto the brain, and then manifested and understood in the brain that way. But it's still coming as a package of information, not this kind of linear Morse code, which is then decoded. It's coming as like a gestalt of information. So I don't understand how that happens at all, and I'm not saying that it's woo or anything like that, but it clearly comes and it's either coming from your unconscious and then reaches up and impacts as a gestaltic picture, or it's coming from outside in the same way. I'm interested in both,
Right.
because it's just fascinating. And we could go on and on about consciousness and where it comes from. Although there's a really interesting physicist, I always forget his name, but he came up with a theory of sort of a quantum theory of a way it's not string theory or anything like that, where he showed that as different structures get created, and more complicated structures get created, such as in the brain, that it actually creates the ability to create something which is independent of the materials that created it. And he's basically saying it's where the soul or consciousness is, how it's created, and that it basically is built from the structures in the brain that then creates a consciousness, which then could actually exist independent of the structure that created it.
Wow.
Fascinating stuff.
Amazing. Where can people find you? Not to cut you off, I don't want to keep you longer than we promised we would, but I want to get that in. So you can finish your point, but then we want to know where we can, where our viewers can find
think,
out.
Twitter is best. I'm afraid to give anybody my email these days, because my email is already like completely overloaded. But you can find me through Stanford, gnolan@stanford.edu. And if you put the word UAP somewhere in the thing, it gets shunted to the right subfolder for me, where I then can pay attention to it, knowing what I'm looking at. I would hesitate for people to just fill my inbox, because there's actually a lot of important cancer-related research that goes into that I need to,
Right.
it can't be interfered with by my side interests.
Right. Yeah, you got your day job to
I have
still
my
do,
day
right?
job,
Yeah.
which is yeah. I mean, and the day job is really about the students and the postdocs, and the research. So
Yeah.
they have to remain at the front of the line.
Yeah. No, we thank you for coming on the podcast. Like I said,
Mhm.
right now you're one of the big guns. You're at the forefront, fighting for, open mind and disclosure. And, it's great to be able to have you on and talk to you and pick your brain a little bit about some stuff we were just curious about. And
Yeah,
from this side of the border on Canada, we fully support you. Like, just
right.
absolutely believe in what you're doing. So
Great.
keep
Well,
up the
thanks
good
so
work.
much.
Yeah.
It was a fun discussion. And sorry
Awesome.
about the glitches.
No worries. That
We'll blame the
happens.
orbs.
We
We'll
blame the
blame the
orbs.
orbs.
Damn orbs.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Garry.